For the past few months, I've been working on a podcast called Event Stars to help people in the events industry, and I've had some really fantastic opportunities to interview some superb people from the industry and beyond. But like many things at the moment, now is not the time to launch it. Now is the time where we need to come together and support each other for what is going to be truly difficult times ahead. So I've been switching it up a little bit while my business is pretty much at zero, and decided to do a podcast that can help people cut through the noise and help businesses hopefully grow and learn during this period. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that something good can come from it. If you've got any suggestions, then feel free to get in touch. Hello and welcome to another episode of Opportunity in Isolation, and continuing on with our theme of, you could say, turning a side hustle into a full-time gig. Today we're going to be talking a lot about getting investment for your startup and why you might want to do that. And I have a conversation with Alex Balderstone. Now, Alex is one of the co-founders at Kaiku, a smart matchmaking platform for first-time venture funds. Kaiku is backed by startup wiseguys, one of Europe's largest early-stage B2B investors. Beyond that, he also heads up venture at Birmingham Enterprise Community Accelerator, one of the fastest growing regional focused accelerators in the UK. Now, this is quite a technical conversation, and we speak a lot about why you might decide to get investment, as well as some of the intricacies of putting yourself out there, including how you can make your startup more attractive to investors by getting certain assurances from HMRC, which lead to tax breaks for investors. And we also talk about some of the ways that you can find the right investor as well, and we go into pitching and your decks. So with that, happy listening and enjoy, and I hope that you find it useful. Alex, first of all, thank you for joining me on this podcast, Opportunity in Isolation. And we are definitely in isolation at the moment. We're talking in the middle of January 2021, in the midst of another lockdown. And what I'm kind of interested in seeing is, I've seen it a lot on social media, on people's Instagrams, is that I've seen a lot of people starting side hustles. So what are your thoughts, being somebody who's in the startup game, and which we'll come on to a little bit later, about people turning side hustles into more full-time occupations? And do you think we're going to see a shift in the number of people in employment as employees for companies now?
Gurmej, well, it's a pleasure to be on. So thanks very much for inviting me. As you say, the sun's out today, fortunately, for January, so it's a good start, hopefully, to the year. But it's a really poignant and interesting subject to start on. I mean, I think there was a lot, especially when lockdown started last year. We saw about what came out after 2008, financial crisis, and when Uber, Airbnb, and when all of these guys were born, really has come from crisis before. And I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head in terms of more people have really had time, in the last sort of 9, 10, 11 months now to look at what they're doing. Are they happy with their work? We don't have to go to the workplace anymore, and that frees up a lot of time. Granted, you've got to spend time with family, or you've got to set something else up. But I think from what I've seen, working in an accelerator and working on a funding platform with my main business, Kaiku, that a lot more opportunities are coming through. And you don't necessarily have to be an expert in everything you're starting, because this is where the opportunity is coming from. So I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, in terms of, we're seeing more and more, and Birmingham is a great example for this. Birmingham has the second highest number of startup registrations in the country, outside London, which is just amazing. But we've never seen that in the local environment in terms of really sort of getting up to scale up phase, because people come down to London. But we're seeing more and more companies coming out at the moment that need that sort of thing. And to sort of give you some examples, the accelerator that I'm involved with in Birmingham enterprise community, a lot of the businesses that have been doing really well, and we've had through more recent cohorts, really did start out like that, maybe 3-4 years ago. One of them, and I think that Don will mind me saying, Evolved Snacks, which is a healthy snack brand that really has been sort of rocketing in its growth. And a lot of this period has been more opportunity rather than an excuse to sort of hide up. It's just we've seen a lot of positives through it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll come on to what you do in early stage growth in a minute. But what do you think some of the steps are that people should take if they've got like a side hustle, so to speak, at the moment, to make it more into a full-time gig?
So there's putting noise out there, which I think is the first thing I'll touch on, and then there's the practical of actually running a business. Putting noise out there, and you all know well people like Gary Vee and the sort of media that comes out from that. I've seen more and more people writing on Substack or a Medium, really trying to get involved with people more virtually, and that was definitely the first thing that we saw when we were doing a load more events with big UK funds and sort of personalities in the entrepreneur world in the UK. When lockdown started, was people are really open if they've got a product to engage with them, and there's nothing really stopping people at the moment to go out there to become informed and really to become really known in their field for what they were doing. A friend of mine who studied at university with me is now running a venture-backed insurtech in India called Bima Pay. Probably pronouncing that wrong. But the whole base of that is it was based on content before. Rahul, who set everything up for that, was one of the best, if not the best, on Substack in the insurtech segment, and came from a little bit more sort of internship corporate background before he moved into it. But we see this with lots of people on the engagement side, that if you have got an interest, there's nothing stopping you reaching out there. On a practical level, there's more and more accelerators, incubator schemes, BEC, as we call it for Birmingham enterprise community. We in the last 10 months are now running 4 different programs. We before just had a 6-month accelerator, but we saw more and more businesses coming at the early stage that really needed that building block support of what we call pre-accelerator or startup sprint, a month's course, and you teach the fundamentals of what people need to build up from there. And the UK's always had a pretty interesting environment in this. If we talk about pre-seed, early stage capital, we've always lagged behind the US. If we got an idea, in the US, a lot of people throw money at it quickly, the Facebooks, everything, and in the Bay Area, for example. But we are getting more of these programs coming out now, more people wanting to support. Unless there is more and more, the capital in the ecosystem last year wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be in terms of dipping. Yes, it started off, but people are now funding remotely. Funds have had to get used to that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we talk a lot about accelerators and startup hubs and communities. When I started out my business, there wasn't like this same sort of ecosystem of communities and accelerators. And it was only when I went on the more of a technology journey, went to some of the conferences like Web Summit and so on, that I learned about accelerators. So what do you want to explain what an accelerator is and the benefits of being in one for a startup? Absolutely.
And, I think the first thing is really to say it's not for everyone. I think and that's a really important thing, because I think a lot of people look at, if we take the definition of accelerator, support program, perhaps 3 months, perhaps 6 months, they may have their own funds, they may put a bit of capital into you to accelerate you, in a nutshell, to get you to the next stage of your growth so that you really focus on what you are doing. I'm going through one at present with Europe's largest B2B accelerator, startup wiseguys, and I'm also heading up venture at Birmingham enterprise community. So sort of see it from both sides. In my experience, you've really, again, you've got to have an affinity with the program. With wiseguys, for example, they're European. I've spent a lot of time in sort of European countries. A lot of our team are over there. So we had a lot of synergies. Brexit is, we're now opening up a base in Italy as well. So there's been a lot of reasons there. It has to make sense. And I think one thing that I've always seen with a number of companies is that, okay, we've been through programs A, B, and C. You start to try and look a little bit in terms of, well, where have they come from the beginning through to the end? And more often than not, I would say, well, it really depends on the program. They could be more confused. They may have been focused on a market that they shouldn't have been going into. But as you say, there are more and more out there at the moment that are vertical. If I was to talk in industry verticals, we're talking about Geovation, which is a sort of a semi-UK government one that's focused on sort of the geography of the world and more prop tech related solutions. You can find them. They can be slightly harder to find sometimes in the UK, because I've always found a little bit more conservative here than programs over in Europe, less risk averse in terms of putting capital in. But there's more and more coming out there for sure.
But one of the things that I recently learned, which has come out of this COVID crisis, is that you could be on an accelerator program from any place in the world and do it from your bedroom now. So I was recently in a program for Startup Istanbul in Turkey, getting advice from mentors from America, from the Far East, from the Middle East, and it was brilliant. And I was able to do that. And at the same time, I was getting all the benefits that come with being in a startup accelerator, including, $5,000 worth of AWS credits, so that we can build on Amazon, and access to Hootsuite and HubSpot and Zendesk.
A lot of things that you just wouldn't be able to act. And I completely concur with that, right? I went through a program called Utec Ventures, which is the largest accelerator in Peru. So I have a co-founder one of my co-founders is over in Panama. So the founding team, we all speak Spanish. Spanish markets is quite a big thing for us in Latin America. And it fitted really well. They're one of the best acceleration programs in Latin America, one of the largest funds in Peru as well. And it's given us huge access to the region. It gives you a lot more visibility on what's happening over there. The networks are very good. And I think, the main thing, a lot of people don't realize that, what you get out of an accelerator through the mentors or the industry connections is worth a hell of a lot more really than what you perceive it to be, because until you've actually gone through one, you don't see that.
Yeah. Tell me about your business, Kaiku, and the work that you do with that.
Sure. So we're essentially a smart matchmaking platform. We use AI to improve the quality of startup engagement with emerging venture funds. So we typically help seed to Series A companies raise funding and then work with about 300 VCs, as we'd call them, in about 50 countries. They range from corporate venture capital funds, such as American Express Ventures, all the way to sort of more UK localized funds as well. So it's interesting, right? Because a lot of this is based on the insights that we get from funds. And, if we look at a lot of this has really come out of the pandemic, more venture having to go remotely, more vehicles in terms of venture funds being set up in corporates. Corporates notoriously have pretty poor innovation agendas. Some are much better than others. They tend to silo their innovation functions separately. BCG Digital Ventures, for example, separate to BCG. But for us, we've just seen much more capital going into the ecosystem. And this includes in Latin America, that is at a much earlier stage. So people that are not typically been used to it before, and that's really where our market's focused. So it's been pretty interesting in terms of how we're doing it. So we're growing the network up, now backed by the largest B2B accelerator in Europe and one of the largest B2B investors at pre-seed and seed stage, opening up a business in Italy at the moment. And I've worked on some pretty cool deals all over the place. So it's scaling is always an interesting point, as you all know, with your company at this stage as well. Sometimes there are pivots that come in. What you've got to focus on. We're now about a team of 13, spread out quite a lot. But I think what was nice for us is we were all remote anyway beforehand. The main thing that comes into this is just sort of focusing a little bit more in terms of what we want to do as a remote business. I think is the main thing that's come in there.
Yeah, so essentially you're matchmaking with investors and startups, people who want to get investment, and investors who are looking for cool startups to invest in. One of the things that I've kind of been advised in the past is it's always preferential to get a warm introduction to an investor. And I think that's something that you're trying to do through AI, aren't you? To not necessarily give a warm introduction, but match someone as close as possible.
Yeah, so the whole industry, especially when a fund starts, maybe a fund one or a fund two of a venture vehicle that hasn't been deploying yet, will have the way that funds are structured. They don't have much money to bring on many employees, so a lot of the time there's not a lot of intelligence on the data side that is used to assess what's coming in. And if you think about the number of decks a VC gets at the end of the day, having to sift those, trying to give feedback on everything. A a lot of these are just based off Airtable, Excel, Google Sheets, whatever you want to call it. And there's not really much streamlining that comes through for the process. There are different verticals. There are platforms such as Affinity, which are really good, but they're more CRM related. So a lot of funds use those, but we're much more focused on the beginning stage, the deal flow, the scouting, and understanding what funds are looking for. So that's really where we sit at the moment on that.
Why would a startup need investment? Explain to people why they'd want to get somebody else to give them money and take it.
This is an interesting line because you don't always need investment, right? You don't need to go to an accelerator. You don't need to get funding. I mean, look, and I think this is a really important distinction between, what we call an SME and what we call a startup. Once a startup is essentially looking for a growth phase, tech, they don't have to be, and you're taking on money, you're committing one way or another to raising more capital. You've got investors on board that want your valuation to increase, to be able to grow that prospect with you. You bring on more money, you bring on more staff, you expand into other markets. The whole thing that this has got to go back down to at the end of the day is really understanding what you want to be. If you want to be a tech platform that's going to expand into the US, that's going to expand into other European countries, yes, you probably want to think about the scalability. And when we're looking day in, day out of pitch decks from all over the place, referral partners, tech stars, whatever, this is the main thing we've got to be. The way that fund mechanics work is for every 10 investments, the VC investing in one deal, that deal's got to outweigh the other 9, because it's incredibly likely that those 9 out of 10 are just going to fail or are going to provide pretty poor returns to the fund. And 95% of funds don't really make a profit. A lot of research has been doing on that in the last few weeks. So you've really got to have that scalability potential to say, hey, I'm actually going to be that unicorn. And I'm not a big fan of the phrase, but it's true. You've really got to think if that's the right way you're going to do it. And it's absolutely fine to just be an SME, to be running your business as you have been. You could be doing pretty well. You might not need capital, though. There's some really good ones out there before. One example I'd give, Design My Night, Nick Telson, it's a booking platform that's being used. They were really well known before they exited of not taking on a lot of external capital. Nick does a lot of great work online, and I'd really recommend having a look at his material about all of this and sort of delving into this a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've known Design My Night for many years because when we were selling tickets for events, they were always the ones who'd be able to sell tickets for us on our behalf. They must have done a lot of work on the back end with SEO and so on. And I think they actually created like a system that clubs could use for their booking side. So I think, they've done really well. And I think they've exited now, haven't they?
They did pre-pandemic. So it was a good time to sort that out.
Definitely. What are some of the mistakes that you see some startups make when they're pitching for funding, whether at the early stage when they're getting their pitch decks together, or later on as they're actually going into these meetings with investors?
I'd really take it. I mean, there's general themes and then there's country by country basis. I definitely see a lot of, actually, this is an example when Accelerator can help you asking for money that they don't need at a valuation that doesn't make any sense. We have a lot of understanding of the US market that you can be pre-revenue, you can raise a lot of money. You see more cases with Sequoia coming into Europe at the moment, putting in a lot of money, and they're not being much there and placing, obviously, their bets on the team. That is a huge thing. And I definitely see that in the UK a lot, and quite a few other European countries getting too ahead of themselves. The other is not understanding the market well enough, for sure. Defensibility, huge thing. Definitely in terms of what can come out there, not having done competitor research enough. I'm saying that after having done a market engineering sprint this week. It's fine to pivot, right? After 5 years, if your business still exists, 70%-ish are changed fundamentally from what they start out to do to where they end up. And I think a lot of founders do get in their head that especially if the first time, that no, this is what I'm going to be doing, it's the right solution. And, that's what evolves in. I think what that culminates in, it's a huge problem of not actually, the number of asking the customer, asking the client and going out there and just getting feedback or even selling something. And it doesn't have to be what they're wanting to do. It could be a sort of more consultancy based arrangement that they're going to scale through tech. The number of people that you say, have you actually gone out there and spoken to a client, or have you spoken to a customer? And it's no. You're like, well, do you really understand what you're doing on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you need to understand your own product and what your customer wants. And I think there's a great article about product market fit in a company called Superhuman, and you've probably come across it. And he said, if you've got product market fit if you take your product away or your service away from your customer and they really, 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 really feel upset that you've taken it away from them. Because I
have to say, I've had a few invites for Superhuman and I seem to be getting more and more week on week to use it. So that must be a good sign. That must be a good sign.
But if you think about some of the things that we use every day, I mean, I use Slack all the time, and if Slack just went tomorrow, then I'll be thinking, right, I need to find something else that's going to be able to replace that, and there might not be something else that can replace.
We had a Slack outage in December. There was a Google outage. No, sorry, there was a Google outage in December as well, and Slack recently. Yeah, and you're thinking, well, what am I going to do? Nothing's working. I can't access email. It really does make you think in terms of what you rely on. And I know you and me both use Lunch Club, for example. I've been using it since about September 2019, and for me, it's pretty essential for sourcing, for new connections. Obviously, we wouldn't have met if you hadn't met Zveti before through Lunch Club, and that's a huge thing. And you really can take for granted sometimes how useful small things are.
Yeah, definitely. SEIS and EIS for startups. Again, it's something that I never really understood or knew about until probably a couple of years ago. Can you explain the significance of it for a startup and for an investor in simple terms for people?
So 70% of it's the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. Tax incentive scheme that, to the top of my mind, about over 20 billion has gone through in the last 20 years, and now represents about 70% of early stage investment going through. It's a process whereby early stage investors can de-risk their investment going into a startup by claiming tax relief, basically. For a company raising up to 150,000, that's what we call SCIS, the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. That tax relief is 50%, and then over that, EIS, it's 30%. There's VCT, venture capital, more sort of elaborate schemes, but the fundamental part of SCIS is where most of it sits. And I think you clicked on, you sort of touched on it quite well. We support a lot of these processes. We see a lot of startups that haven't got this process sorted, that do have an entity, and really it's one of those sorts of, how would I say, you want to have it in place before you go into a meeting, because it's almost just expected nowadays. If an investor's going to come in, a fund, not all the time, but likely to be, if they're in the UK, to be structured as in this sense, or equally, an angel investor is going to be wanting to claim relief through that.
And what about other countries? Do they have similar schemes that you know of?
They do, but it differs on scheme. For example, it doesn't exist in Italy because we've been going through that process at the moment, albeit I luckily didn't have to deal with that work, and there's a lot of bureaucracy in the Italian system. So that's not something I want to be, I've specifically gone into. It really depends country by country. Portugal's got its own scheme that works over there as well. Germany's got something sort of semi-hybrid, but it's a lot harder to set up over there if you're not there and you don't have a German co-founder, etc. as well. So they do exist, but they're pretty localized to what's happening. One thing that is interesting, though, that I think actually may be useful to some of your viewers, if you've got another entity or another business overseas, a lot of these schemes nowadays require their parent entity to be in the EEA, the European Economic Area, which the UK isn't anymore as well. And it's one potential problem that we've been experiencing at the moment as well. So they're very good to get, but you want to be getting the right localized advice, because otherwise, if you've got several entities, it can get messy.
Definitely. And I see a lot of people now talking about Estonia as being some kind of a startup hub. I don't understand exactly why. I think it's something to do with tax incentives. I don't know if you maybe. So
I'll give you some of that. So wiseguys, ironically, actually are they're from Estonia. Their main base is in Tallinn. I think, there's the e-residency scheme, which allows you to not be living in a European country, but to set up a company very easily and to have access to the European market through e-residency, which is a pretty important thing. The Baltic region is pretty advanced in fintech as well. The legislation in terms of sandboxes is really open. That's why you see a lot of the Revolut operations over there and a lot of other big fintechs. I think it was actually yesterday I was watching something from Invest in Lithuania, and globally they're the fourth biggest market for fintechs and access to markets, and the second in Europe. So it's pretty interesting. And I think last I looked, the amount of VC in Estonia is the same as in Turkey. If you think of the Moneezies, the Skypes, the Bolts, a lot of them come from over there, set up shop in the UK as well, and it goes pretty well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure TransferWise is from there as well. Yeah, so yeah, it definitely seems to be flavour of the month at the moment. What would you say some of the rules are about finding the right investor? Because someone once said it to me that it's almost like finding a wife, if you can, or a husband.
It's like dating. It is. I think you will go through the mill. I think what people don't understand is, and I had this chat with Chris, I'm going to get his position wrong, Chris Heavley, who's, I think he's SVP of Ecosystem at Techstars, just before Christmas. And it was actually on one of the events that Zeti held with Ecosystem Giants, which is what she runs. And the conundrum is normally about 5 to 20% of your time at any point is going to be fundraising, right? So even if you're not live fundraising, you've got to be keeping leads warm. If you've got investors already there that may come in later, you want to be keeping them up to date. There are small things like, make a list on MailChimp, that is just for your advisors, just for people that have been interested and you've had conversations with before. I think the first thing is people wholly underestimate the time that it takes. We're going to do this in 3 months. No, extend it to 6. It's, we're going to speak to 20 people. We're going to go back. No, you're going to, as I think I've heard you say on other videos before, you're going to have 100 conversations. You're not going to get a lot of replies from all of them. And you really can't take it personally. It's just how, unfortunately, a lot of the industry works. And there are a lot of people trying to do much better things on that in terms of openness to capital. Utec Ventures down in London is a great example. They do a lot of great work and focus on industries that really need a lot more diversity and capital diversity. VCs linked in with that quite a lot as well. And it's a full-time job. Simply put, raising money is a full-time job. It's not something that you can switch off for one week and go back to the next. It's, if you want to do this, you've got to do it properly. And unfortunately, there's the cold start problem. You need to have a term sheet to really bring in some others to help that process.
And what do you advise startups when it comes to the legal side? Because I'm sure a lot of the investors are pretty savvy in terms of their legals, but startups, they might have they've just started for a start and they might not know where to go to find a lawyer who's going to be able to help them with that.
Yeah, there was some good advice I had from an advisor once, which was find a good lawyer at this stage. And fortunately, we have. And I would highly recommend that at the beginning. And I think people, again, underestimate it's this at the beginning. If you're starting a platform, I shouldn't be saying this because I'm not a lawyer, but, can you copy T's and C's? Can you get other platform terms? Can you modify? Yeah, technically you can. There are more resources out there nowadays, like Seed Legals, Farilio, that are really good just for accessing resources where you don't need a lawyer. And the industry hasn't seen them properly, pre sort of 3 years ago. They didn't exist because it would be all the sort of the typical firms and they'd be pretty marked up prices for work that was, how would I put it? You could do on a Farilio or Seed Legals. When you get to a certain stage, however, you want the right person there. If you've got a term sheet coming in, if you've got a shareholders agreement you've got to deal with, you need that looked over properly because you're right. Yes, we did an event, a good example. We did an event in Edinburgh with RBS, with Archangels, Techstar, and Accelerator Digital Ventures just pre-pandemic. I think it was last March before everything kicked off. And I remember making one comment when I was moderating. I didn't understand how good the angel scene was in Scotland. And when you look at local financing opportunities in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, with Invest Northern Ireland, they're fantastic. They really are quite, in my opinion, quite far ahead than certain regions in the UK. It's not to say that, like Newcastle's very good, Ignite's done a huge amount of great work up there, but there are certain regions, without naming them, that, as you say, you'll get some angels that will come along that may have a certain structure, and you really need someone to come back to you and say, hey, no, this is not fair. You're taking too much of the company.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm just thinking about some of the startups that you would have come across that you've seen succeed from accelerators versus those that haven't. What do you think some of the habits or the traits are that those that have succeeded have had versus those that didn't?
I think a big thing goes back to actually looking at, have you got common purpose with the accelerator that you're going into? There are more nowadays like Founders Factory. F10 is one that I always recommend people to look at in Switzerland and Spain that work with corporates. LMarks is a good example. They're one of the biggest provider of corporate innovation programs in the UK, or if not the biggest. I think they are the biggest. You really need to know what you're going in for. If you know what you're going in for, and you've got an overlap, for example, with Techstars London and Barclays, great. It's going to go really well as long as you can find that overlap. LMarks, for example, do programs all over the place with Lloyd's of London, the Lloyd's labs they run, and a load of other large companies. But you really need to have purpose for going in. Those ones that have purpose, those ones that click with the investors, the geography, really do excel when they come out of it. And you need to know what they're asking for. Is there a cost to the program and everything like that? The people that just keep going from accelerator to accelerator will get lost. A few will make sense, but several won't. And the more you do, I think people will start to question, why do you keep going through these? If there's a larger incentive, that's different, especially if there's investment for equity coming in. But you've really got to be focused on why you're going in.
And in the next 12 to 18 months, where do you think the key areas of growth are going to be in the startup scene?
It's always an industry question, right? I mean, in terms of verticals that we're focused on at the moment, we mainly do fintech, B2B SaaS, deep tech, and then a big one that's been more recent for us is logistics and supply chain. I definitely, having sent things to Europe recently and not knowing where the hell they are, know that it's not going to get any easier. And I just think, being in a more globalized world, logistics, supply chain is going to be a huge thing that we see there as well. We've seen a lot of things more sort of events orientated, moving online, software there. I think jury's still out there in terms of what are we going to see. It was just this morning that I saw an article or a post that was written by the head of marketing at wiseguys talking about engagement with online platforms. I haven't looked into it enough. I prefer, as I think you said, going to Bits and Pretzels, Web Summit, and I like the atmosphere. You get the local startups and everything like that. I think that will come back. Again, another thing's prop tech, right? We're seeing more sort of co-working spaces, the whole failure behind WeWork, and what's been coming out of that. There's quite a few platforms nowadays in terms of working down your local cafe and things like that. I do think those will come back for sure. And a lot of people will be looking at, how do you analyze that? What's the data? And how do we structure that? But that's, without being biased, those are the verticals that we've been focused on.
Yeah, I think, looking at the event space, because I'm in the event space, I don't think anyone has come up with a solution yet on recreating that networking that you do as you're walking down an aisle of an exhibition hall or you're doing at the bar at the end of a conference. Because when people come to an online conference, they're only going to be there for the period of time that they need to be there. Then they're going to log off and go, cook themselves some dinner or see to their kids or whatever, and that's it. Whereas when you go to a conference, you're kind of fully immersed in the whole experience of it.
I think there's a lot of things you can't recreate. As I say, jury's still out. We're seeing vaccinations, we're seeing better returns at the moment. Yes, we are still in lockdown for the foreseeable future, but there is going to be a time where there'll be a reverting back to what we did know before.
Brilliant. Alex, it's been so good to have you on today. Have you got any sort of final thoughts or anything that you'd want to say to people about, starting up at the moment or business in general?
Always happy to, if it's not me or someone in the team, if someone wants to chat to us, funding, SCIS, whatever, experience in accelerators. We're involved in quite a lot of sort of European ecosystems as well. Really happy on that side. I think the main thing is put content out there. As we're doing now, if you can connect with people on your wavelength, you really will make a mark for yourself in terms of what's coming out. And you don't have to be Gary V at the end of the day. He has a whole team. I think about 3-4 people that work just on that content. I mean, I can see you shaking your head at any one point, working on that at any one point. But look, I think sales going out there, there's nothing stopping anyone, and I could only sort of couldn't say that anymore.
Alex, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening and watching. If you've got any suggestions or any feedback, then feel free to get me on Twitter at GurmejSP or Insta at events_Gurmej, spelled Gurmej. Thank you for listening. Catch you soon.